being human is really hard. And there are a lot of ways that we try to essentially become superhuman or avoid the really hard parts about being human. So if you've been to my channel before, most of my content is about religion and leaving religion and kind of my lack of belief in God and how that affects your life. And I think that there are other things that we do all the time where we are essentially engaging in magical thinking. We are believing, that practices or diets or some sort of substance is going to relieve us from being human and help us be sort of transcendent or help us experience the world in a way that isn't so hard. And I completely understand that type of thinking. And so I am not in the business of dashing hopes. I think promoting false hope, though, is more harmful than it is helpful. And so I think we should really understand what we're putting our hopes in and if they can actually deliver. So, this series is going to diverge a little bit from my typical content in that it's not going to be necessarily focused on religion or Christianity, but different types of ways that we are engaging in magical thinking. Again, things like practices, lifestyles, products, dietary patterns that come with promises of magic. And we can look at the evidence and see if it actually meets those magical claims. All right, you ready? The one I want to do today is intermittent fasting. This is a really nice, I think, like intersection between religion and kind of the more physical world, because fasting certainly can be a religious practice and or it can be a practice of trying to promote physical health. So I want to spend most of the time today talking about the physical promises of this type of fasting. Fasting in general is used with lots of different religions, and it's a tool for improving your connection to a deity, for essentially doing a tradition or a practice that is self-sacrificial in order to demonstrate your devotion. And it can be, again, just part of a tradition in the way that you practice your religion. And so I'm going to kind of shelve those particular claims to talk about people who are using fasting in order to improve their physical health. And I want to talk about the magical claims that are associated with that eating pattern. So, intermittent fasting actually came about many years ago in a research lab where the researchers were looking at the lifespan of mice. If you've ever worked in a research lab, you may never have, but in a research lab with mice, mice are kept often individually in cages, sometimes in groups in cages, and they typically have free access to their food. So they will have a dispenser for their food. They often have well-regulated conditions, and people are refilling the food as often as needed. So the mice can eat whenever they want. This research was a little different, and they instead restricted the mice's access to food. And so they only allowed the mice to eat about 75% of the typical calories that they would eat. And they did this for the whole duration of the mice lives. If you don't know anything about mice, mice typically live, if we sort of let them be in a lab, they live about 3 years. So a typical maximal lifespan for mice is about 3 years. But these mice that were getting just 75% of their typical caloric intake were actually extending their lifespan. So they were living longer, and they were living longer by about 6 months. And so if your lifespan is 3 years, extending that by an additional 6 months, that's pretty significant. That's a big change. So this was super exciting when it first came out, because for all of the advances in science that we have improved the average lifespan. We have improved your healthy lifespan. So we are remaining healthy and functional longer and longer. But we really haven't touched the maximal lifespan. For as much as we have human records, the maximal lifespan of humans is still about 110 to 115 years. There are a few claims above that. Those are challenging to verify. But generally speaking, our max lifespan isn't more than 110, 115. And so this was the first time that scientists had intervened in some way that actually extended the lifespan. So this would be something like living to be 140, something like that. So a big change. When you're trying, though, to translate animal models into humans, there are a lot of pitfalls. We have much more complex lives than animals in an animal facility in a research lab do. And we can't just directly apply that to humans. There certainly have been some studies, though, that have looked at, is this a way to extend our life? Can we use this caloric restriction to live longer? Why would caloric restriction help us live longer? This is a weird evolutionary function that our bodies have, that in essence, us living also kind of damages our cells and damages our bodies. You know, we are exposed to UV radiation, viruses and bacteria, but also just the stress of exercising and eating and breathing. All of those things are sort of utilizing our cells, and they seem to have basically like a set end date where they've been used enough that they aren't able to do their functions any longer. And so basically the sort of thought process behind the caloric restriction is that you are slowing down the function of your body. Think of it kind of like hibernating, basically, like going for a period of time where your body just isn't doing as many functions, and therefore it's essentially lasting longer. I know I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's the idea of how this was thought to help extend lifespan. We can't directly do this research in humans, though, because we can't recruit infants and restrict their caloric intake against their will and force them to remain on a caloric restricted diet their entire 85 years of life. That is impractical and also unethical. So we can't do the same type of, we can't do the same type of research in humans that we do with the mice. Instead, you have to do shorter term interventions and try and look for changes that might predict the outcome you want. So there was research that used caloric restriction and looked at different blood markers of damage, essentially, and seeing, does this help? Does this improve these blood markers of damage? We run into some problems with continued caloric restriction in humans. We also see some significant negative side effects. Being continually restricted has negative psychological effects. It has negative just social effects, but it also seems to have some negative physical effects as well. And so doing this just sustained caloric restriction isn't really feasible or even potentially practical or helpful for humans. So out of that research came this idea of time-restricted feeding, basically this intermittent fasting. So instead of restricting just the total calories, the researchers said, well, let's just restrict the time that they have access to their food. So this is pretty easy to do in mice. You can just allow their food to be available for, say, 8 hours, and then take it away for 16 hours. The easy thing is the mice are going to be compliant because they can't climb out of their cages and find their food. So you know that they're actually following the schedule. In these mice that were time restricted, it was giving their physiology kind of basically this extended time period to really finish all their digestion, allow for cellular cleanup of all the cellular functions, getting rid of any potential cellular damage. And there were some benefits seen in the mice. And this is something that you can investigate in humans. You can look at this in adults. They can, you can put them in a lab, or you can trust them to do it on their own and see, is this benefiting their health? So now we're finally getting here to these magical claims. So out of this animal research, again, came this sort of time-restricted feeding idea. And this is where you're getting the claims that intermittent fasting is going to change your life, change everything, make everything better, essentially. So some of the claims aren't that wild. Claims around intermittent fasting are that it would help you lose weight, that it would reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes. There are some claims that it would reduce cancer, essentially slow the progression of cancer, or that it would prevent cancer. And then the more hard to nail down claims are things like this way of eating is going to give you so much energy. It's going to improve your cognitive function. You are essentially going to turn into this superhuman version of yourself if you just eat this way. And to be clear, if you want to be on that 8-16 schedule of eating for 8 hours and then fasting for 16, it's really just a fancy way of saying I skip breakfast. And that doesn't sound as cool and sexy and innovative, but that's essentially what it is. You're fitting all of your meals from probably noon to 8 p.m., something like that. So does it work? Kind of. So the research done in this area, it's looked at a few variations of this type of eating pattern. But when the hypothesis was around weight loss, intermittent fasting practices usually performed similarly to other diets. Sometimes they performed a little bit better. And when the researchers would look at blood markers for things like cardiovascular disease, so maybe they would look at blood lipids, cholesterol, blood glucose. Sometimes the people using intermittent fasting fared a little bit better. But the mechanism that this is helping, the way that this is working, it's most likely that people are restricting their total number of calories. And if their body weight was not at a healthy range for their height, if weight loss occurred, that weight loss could explain the improvements in their blood markers. So from a cardiovascular disease weight loss perspective, intermittent fasting can be a viable strategy. It is just not magic. And so you might see similar outcomes using intermittent fasting that you would see with other types of dietary restriction. When you get into the more fanciful claims, the claims that it's going to clear your mind and make you feel amazing and so energized. Those aren't really well supported. So these are, I think of it as like a way to wrap this idea in something that sounds exciting. And who among us does not want more energy and more focus? It's something that is really appealing to so many of us who are exhausted. So does intermittent fasting change your baseline energy levels? It doesn't seem so. And does it extend your lifespan? Not that we can measure, but there's a little bit of research that says that like markers of cellular damage are lower in people who are eating this way. So I would say maybe the jury is still out, but probably not. So intermittent fasting, is it magic? No, but it's not the worst thing. I think if intermittent fasting fits in with your existing lifestyle, if it just fits with your schedule and it's something that is reasonably enjoyable and sustainable for you, then it's not a bad thing. Some cautions that I would keep in mind. For anyone who is pregnant or breastfeeding, you don't want to restrict your calories this way. For anyone who has struggled with an eating disorder, this way of eating can be really triggering. Additionally, for women, restricting your diet like this, whether it be fasting or really low carbohydrate diets or low calorie diets, often are less successful in women. Like women's bodies tend to, how do I explain this easily? It becomes an additional stressor, and women don't see the outcomes that they're hoping for as often as men do. And so I would also caution women, if you're thinking of eating in this way, just make sure you keep track of kind of your overall health through the process. So I think overall for magical claims, I maybe give it a C plus. So some good things, some bad, but not the worst thing. So let me know what you think about this idea, this series of looking at magical claims and whether they hold up. And I'm happy to entertain any other suggestions and ideas.